Good morning, dear friends, and welcome once again to the Temple of Light, which today is full of light. I'm Sanjaya, and I want to share a few thoughts with you today on today's topic, which is from self to service. In other words, how can we go from the little egoic self by means of service to realizing our true selves? So, what is it that people usually identify with when they talk about their self? It could be their gender, their race, their color, their religion, or perhaps age, education, profession, habits, talents, or their attitudes, their character. And all these things together people usually refer to as their personality. And it's this acquired personality, or perhaps even, I could say, imposed personality, because from the moment we're born, it's imposed on us by our parents, our family, school, church, education, society. It's this personality, this acquired or imposed personality, that most of us are constantly trying to serve throughout our lives. We're constantly attending to both its physical and emotional needs, and even more so to its physical and emotional desires. Why? Why do we do that? In the hope, of course, of finding happiness, because that's what we all want in the end. We're all searching for happiness. No one does anything thinking that it will bring them unhappiness, at least not consciously. And people spend their whole lives in this endless search for happiness outside themselves through serving this personality and its egoic desires. Well, let's listen to what Yogananda has to say about personality. Yogananda says that your true personality begins to develop when you're able, by deep intuition, to feel that you are not this solid body, but are the divine, eternal current of life and consciousness within the body. So, in other words, this personality that we identify with, according to Yogananda, is not our true personality. Our true personality is that divine consciousness within us. That's our true self. And in fact, not only Yogananda, but all the masters tell us that this little self, with its egoic desires, is the soul's identification with the body, with the personality, with all the acquired and imposed things I mentioned earlier. So the soul, or the true self, has actually forgotten its true nature as an individualized and inseparable part of spirit, or part of God. Identifying with this little self, the soul's identification with the body, not only makes us think that we are separate from God, but it makes us think too that we're separate from other people and other things. And that sense of separation is exactly what the ego is. We forget who we really are. We forget the nature of our true self. And the problem is this, that as long as there's ego, there's no possibility of true or lasting happiness. Because true happiness lies beyond the ego. It lies in that true self, in that true personality, in that divine consciousness which is within us. And so we could say any movement toward union with our true self will bring us happiness. Any movement away from union with that true self will bring us unhappiness. So in this sense, the ego, or the little self, is an obstacle on our path to happiness. Think of the light of the sun and the moon. The sun is the source of light. the moon reflects it. Just as within us, the soul is the source of light, and it's this light that the ego reflects. The problem is that the ego says, this is my light. I am the source of light. And it deceives us, it tricks us into believing that, yes, it's the ego that is the source of light for us. So we don't identify with the true source of light, which is our true inner divine self. So the ego then is something we have to overcome. On the other hand, it's indispensable in our first steps towards self-realization. It's necessary, at least at the beginning of our spiritual growth. It's a bit like a seed, a flower seed that is in the ground. The seed has to put down roots downward into the soil in order to ground itself, in order to have a firm foundation, in order that later it can shoot up through the earth and flower into the flower that it's destined to be. Swami Kriyananda says on this topic of the ego being both a friend and enemy, he says, ego is enemy and friend. Which it is depends on our aim in life, whether to expand our understanding or remain stuck at our level of spiritual evolution. If we embrace expansion to broader realities, ego is our friend, helping us to reach to our true self, the soul. If we incline to selfishness, however, the ego is our enemy. It alienates us from who we really are. And the ego has a choice. Or rather, we have that choice. We can embrace the limitation and suffering imposed on us by our ego, or we can reach towards limitless freedom and joy. That's an explanation by Swami Kriyananda of how the ego is both our friend and our enemy, depending on how we use it. But it's only when love in our hearts has become so strong for God, when the consciousness of our limitations imposed by the ego becomes so unbearable, when we suffer, in other words, because suffering is basically the motivation we have for progressing on our spiritual path, it's only then when we have this love in our hearts for God and we're suffering because of the limitations of the ego that we begin to try to release the ego's hold on us so that we, like the little flower seed, can become what we really are. So, how do we go from gratifying this egoic little self and overcoming its limitations to achieving contact with our real self, to realizing our true self? And this is where service comes in. Service is a word that doesn't really resonate very well with us, particularly because it's associated with other words like servitude or servant, which have their roots, their etymological roots, in the Latin word servus, which means slave. They're words that immediately provoke a reaction, a negative reaction on the part of the ego, at the idea of any form of submission or any form of submission to the will or the needs of another person. So, far from being associated with overcoming egoic limitations and realizing the true self, service is a concept which is more often associated with drudgery, with the drudgery arising from a necessity, a duty, or an obligation. We serve, usually unwillingly, in exchange for something. It could be money, power, recognition, or we serve for moral or patriotic reasons, for our family, our country, our society. Or we serve simply because we don't have any choice, We're obliged by some circumstances or by someone else, something beyond our control. But the kind of selfless service that I'm talking about is much more than this. Service is a way of offering ourselves into a greater reality, into the greater reality of God. And by offering ourselves into that greater reality, we expand ourselves into that reality. So, service shouldn't be done with the thought that we're simply serving others, but with the consciousness that we are in fact serving God through them. And even more, even better, that it's not we who are serving, but God is serving others through us. And even at a higher level, we could say, God is serving God through this service that we are acting as channels for. Done in this way, we become freed from that sense of ego, from that sense of egotism. Serving is a doorway which opens for us. It provides an escape for us from the prison of self-preoccupation. It helps us to avoid ego motivation. It releases us from all thought of attachment to I and mine. It releases us from the thought, everything I do is for my own personal benefit. Because what is egotism? It's nothing but the constant reference of everything to one's own self, one's own little self, one's own little personality. Service, which results in this sense of soul expansion, is one of the surest ways to God. And there's a useful affirmation given to us by Swami Kriyananda, which I would recommend that you use while you are serving, to remind us that we are serving in order to expand ourselves and not for egoic reasons which limit ourselves. And the affirmation is this: renouncing my little egoic self, I expand with my great soul self everywhere. I'll repeat it again. Renouncing my little egoic self, I expand with my great soul self everywhere. Try to remember that affirmation the next time you are serving someone or serving God through them. So this concept of serving as a way of breaking the ego's hold on the self is the very essence of what we call karma yoga. Karma yoga, we could call it there are many definitions, but one definition, we could call it the path of selfless service. Because it aims to cut those bonds of ego involvement by helping us to act in the right way. Not just to act, but to act in the right way. In other words, it leads us from self-gratification to self-offering, from self-limitation to self-expansion, from the little self to the true self, from ego consciousness to God consciousness. Karma yoga is one of the four principal paths of yoga, and it's often described as the yoga of action, but it would be far better described as the yoga of right action. Right action is anything that brings us closer to God, which creates no new karma and which helps us to dissolve past karma. Wrong action is anything that nourishes the ego by contracting it through selfishness or by inflating it with pride, and anything that takes us away from God from our true self. For action to be right action, it must be done with the right attitude. So there are three things which constitute the right action, the right attitude in karma yoga. It must be done selflessly, not for self-gain, but in the spirit of being useful to others and ultimately helping God. With no desire, nishkam in Sanskrit, no desire for the action, no attachment to the fruits of the action. And finally, in the consciousness that we are not the doer, but that God is the doer through us. We are channels for God's work. It's this right attitude that distinguishes karma yoga from simply activity. Because one of the basic principles of karma yoga is that it's not important what we do, but how we do it. Any work can be of spiritual benefit. Absolutely any work can help us in our spiritual growth and give us joy if it's done with this correct attitude. And of course, we're not required to simply believe this truth or to be persuaded of it by persuasive arguments. Kriya Yoga, like all paths of yoga, is not a religion or a belief system. It's a science. And we're all free to experiment and test the truth of karma yoga. So service as karma yoga doesn't simply mean restless activity, which leads to fatigue. But it brings inner calmness, it brings joy, and it brings that feeling of expansiveness. When we feel fatigue, it's a certainty that it's the ego that's involved in what we're doing, because it's the ego that feels fatigue, not the soul. Fatigue is a symptom of self-centeredness. So selfless service helps us to become conscious of the truth that our separateness from God is simply an illusion. And there's one more aspect of service that I need to mention, because it's not just about service. All the masters tell us that the secret of the spiritual life is to balance selfless service with meditation. All service should be sustained by meditation. Yogananda says on this topic, the two paths, meditation and service, must work together. When they are balanced, then meditation helps your work, and work helps your meditation. The right attitude I was talking about previously is helped, our action rather, is guided by right attitude when it begins with meditation, when it's kept centered in the calmness that we experience from meditation, and in that calmness when it's offered to God. All action really should begin from calmness. Calmness is not something passive, just the opposite. Calmness is the basis for action. It's dynamic. It's not like peace, which brings rest. Calmness is a preparation for action, and it gives us the power that we need for action. So all our actions should stem from this calmness that we find in meditation. All agitation is contrary to good. All calm is constructive of good. All great work for God is done first in the individual soul of the worker. First be calm with God if you want to be active for God. We've learned in the outside world that the most important thing for action is speed. But in the spiritual world, on the spiritual path, the most important thing is calmness. If you want to get things done, if you want to be active for God. When the surface of the water isn't calm, it can't reflect the sun. So similarly, when we are not calm, we can't reflect the work that God wants us to do. God works through us better when we are calm. So go slowly from one activity to the next. Take time to rest and meditate between activities. All work that results from resting with God in meditation is a miracle work. So we should seek calm. People think that by finishing quickly what they have to do, they will become calm. On the spiritual path, it's just the opposite. We begin with calmness. We do our service in calmness. And we need to learn to be calm in the midst of activity. Yogananda says on this topic, be calmly active and actively calm. And to conclude, I just want to summarize some of the things I've said. The prime duty of all of us is to release ourselves from attachment to the ego or the little self in order to realize our true self. Selfish actions hold us back on the spiritual path. Unselfish actions move us forward. Serving through unselfish work leads us to the freedom which is the spiritual goal of all of us. And in fact, it's easy to see that in most religions, in most true spiritual paths, the basic code of ethics is not self-gratification, but self-sacrifice. By losing the self, you find the true self. So we should look for every opportunity to serve others as a step to liberating ourselves, to freeing ourselves from the ego. The key to right action, as Yogananda says, be active for God, with the thought, God is doing this through me. And I'd like to leave you with an affirmation, a very beautiful affirmation, again by Swami Kriyananda, that should be the basis for all the service we do. I will serve God through others, and by my service to Him, release the hold the ego has on me. I will serve God through others, and by my service to Him, release the hold the ego has on me. I will serve God through others, and by my service to Him, release the hold the ego has on me. Buon servizio. Good service to all.